Okay guys, this episode is going to be a little, unusual. You see, I'm going to do my second attempt at a feature I like to call the better choice. However, the games I've decided to look at aren't exactly among the best. In fact, they're downright terrible. As such, I can't really call either of them the better choice, so I guess this'll be more of a least bad choice? Yeah, this'll come down more to which of these games you'd be least upset to get. Like, if your grandmother were to pick up one of these games from some bargain bin somewhere and give it to you as a gift, which of these would be less likely to get her killed? Well, let's find out by comparing Planet of the Apes on Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. You heard right, there's a video game based on Planet of the Apes. In fact, there's a couple, but we're going to focus on these handheld versions for now. Before we go any further though, let me just say that I freaking love the Planet of the Apes franchise. I love pretty much everything about it. Well, almost everything.
Take your stinking hands off me, you damn dirty human!
Fuck, I hate that film. And wouldn't you know it, that's the film these games are based on. Well, sort of. You see, while it is true that these games were made and released to coincide with the 2001 Burton remake, they don't really have all that much to do with that film. They're actually more reminiscent of the first sequel, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, as they're all about a space pilot named Ben who's been sent out to find the protagonist from the first film, Taylor. I guess this is slightly better than the alternative, but I'm sorry, these games are just insulting. There's pretty much nothing about them that works, they're simply terrible. That said, I do think one of them is slightly better than the other, so without any further ado, let's just get this started by finding out which one has the best visuals. Now, you might think it's a bit unfair to compare the visuals of two games from two separate generations, as one of them will obviously have more advanced graphics, but that's not all there is to this. In fact, I think the less advanced game looks better. Okay, so none of these games are exactly breathtaking or anything, but at least for the time, they do have some relatively impressive character models and animations. The backgrounds are also pretty excellent, and there's a fair amount of nice touches and attention to detail. However, I for one just think the color version is more pleasing to the eye. It's kinda like looking at a nice painting versus a fairly pixelated photo. I don't know about you, but I for one prefer the nice painting. I guess the cutscenes, or the still images this game uses as cutscenes, look a little better in the advanced version, as it manages to replicate the film characters' likeness a bit more, but that's really the only time it's at all superior. Just look at the mutants, for example. I wouldn't really say they look all that much like their film equivalents in either game, but they're at least acceptable in the color version. In the advanced version, they just look ridiculous. I mean, really? You thought it was a good idea to make the mutants look like a bunch of leather coat-wearing douchebags? Why? In all seriousness though, the advanced version may be technically more impressive, and I guess it looks a bit more realistic, but it just isn't as easy on the eyes. As such, the point for the best visuals has to go to the Game Boy Color version. So, having covered which version is more pleasing to the eyes, let's find out which one is less offensive to the ears. This is the best, least bad audio. Yeah, in case that introduction didn't tip you off, neither of these games sound all that good. In fact, they're ear-bleedingly awful. Honestly, if you ever play either of these games, do not, I repeat, do not play with the sound on. It will literally drive you fucking insane. Fair enough, the music isn't actually the worst I've ever heard, but for the love of Beelzebub's penis, couldn't you have changed it up a little bit for just a fucking second? I'm not even exaggerating here. These games have exactly one track. One very short, very annoying track that plays over and over and over and over and over again throughout the entire fucking game. It never ever changes. Seriously, even if you love this track, you'll still want to strangle an orphan by the end of the game. It's that fucking annoying. Well, why don't you just turn it off then, I hear you wonder? And the answer is despicably simple. Because you can't! No, really, you can't turn this shit off. Oh, there is an option to do so, but if you use it, you actually turn off all the sound, so you might as well just mute the TV. Fucking bullshit! Just because I'd rather have my ears ripped off than listen to this music for another second, it doesn't mean I don't want to hear the fucking sound effects, you incompetent morons! I'd still recommend turning the sound off though, as it's not worth suffering through this musical vomit just to hear a few sound effects. With that said, you might be thinking that none of these versions actually win this round, but you'd be wrong. You see, while the music in both versions is fucking atrocious, I do think one of them has slightly better sound effects. In the color versions, it's just a bunch of bleeps and bloops that all sound pretty much the same, and I'm sorry, the sound for when you receive damage just doesn't fit at all. In the advanced version though, they actually sound pretty decent and seem to fit much better. Yeah, maybe this is somewhat expected, seeing as how the Advance is obviously capable of reproducing much higher quality sounds than the Color, but still, I don't feel like I have a choice here. The Advance simply has much better, more defined and more fitting sound effects, which is why it wins the point for the least bad audio. Now, while how a game looks and sounds is relatively important, it's not quite as important as how you make your way through it. As such, let's find the best level design. I have to admit, this one's a bit tricky. I mean, both of these games have some pretty decent levels, and for the most part they're almost identically laid out. However, there are some differences, and I do think one version comes out slightly better than the other. Again, the actual levels are pretty similar in terms of both look and layout, but the placement of the various items and weaponry aren't quite the same. For example, in the advanced version, you'll get a pistol in the second level and a shotgun in the third, whereas you only have this dinky little knife until the fifth level in the color version. This all means that the advanced version has a better sense of progression, whereas the color version ends up feeling a bit unfair and dragged out. Okay, so the color version is still far from impossible, and it's not like it feels all that different, but overall I just think the advanced version is slightly better. Fair enough, this might be a bit of a nitpick, but I honestly couldn't find anything else about the level design to split these games on. They're both very similar with only minor differences, but ultimately those differences do make the advanced version the one with the best level design. So while all the previous parts have had at least some importance, none of it would really matter at all if you didn't have some way to control the action. Or lack thereof. Let's finish this off by finding the least shitty controls. Like I said, this is one of, if not the most important part of any game. After all, if the controls are horrible or don't work at all, you won't really be able to enjoy the game anyway. Unfortunately for these games, the controls here aren't exactly brilliant. Okay, so the problems here have more to do with the control style than the actual control schemes, but yeah, they're pretty terrible. I mean, even simple movement can be a hassle, as you, for instance, can't just turn around like normal. No, you first have to tap the button to slowly turn your character around, and then you can start to move. It's a bit hard to explain, but trust me, it's really awkward. The jumping is also very cumbersome. Instead of just having one jump button, you have to press up to jump straight up, and the A button to jump sideways. I know, it doesn't sound all that bad, but again, it just feels weird and unnatural. The worst thing though has to be the way you use the weapons. Oh, they work well enough once you actually use them, but before you can do so, you have to equip them, which takes way too fucking long. Seriously, there are several areas where you are guaranteed to take damage from the enemies just because you can't get your weapons out in time. It also doesn't help that you can't just have the weapons equipped at all times, as you aren't able to run, jump, or climb ladders with them. Honestly, these controls just ruin what little enjoyment you might have been able to get from these games, and they're both equally terrible. Well, almost. You see, there is one thing, one very minor, tiny little thing that does actually differentiate the controls a bit. The shoulder buttons. Yeah, that's what this one's gonna come down to. The fact that the advanced version has and uses shoulder buttons. Granted, it only uses them to cycle through your inventory, but that does feel and work slightly better than using the select button like you do in the color version. This is a really close call, as again, there's very little difference here, but as the advanced version does have this admittedly tiny addition, I have to give it the point for the least shitty controls. Let me be absolutely clear on this. None of these games are really all that good. Or hell, they're fucking dreadful. I wouldn't recommend picking up either of them for any reason because there's absolutely no good reason to do so. That said, I did make this whole video to find out if one of these games could be called slightly better than the other, and if you've been paying attention, you should already know which one that is. It may not be as visually pleasing as its counterpart, but it does have slightly better audio, the level design works a bit better, and it just barely wins out in terms of controls. As such, I have to declare that the least bad choice when it comes to the handheld versions of the Planet of the Apes game is the Game Boy Advance version. Ultimately though, you really shouldn't give either of these games a try, but I guess you'll survive if someone were to give you the advanced version. After all, it could be much worse. I mean, you could get the PlayStation game. No!